Pardon me. Can everyone hear me now? All right. I'm going to take it from the top. Welcome everyone to the panel on tap. I hope everyone can hear me well. Yes. My name is Derek Perkinson. I'm with the National Action Network. We welcome you all to the panel on tap, the historic denial of education of Black Americans. The National Action Network is a civil rights organization in our 31st year, started by our president and founder, Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton. Reverend Sharpton has always fought for the voiceless. And like many others, those incarcerated are oftentimes voiceless and forgotten about. I serve as the crisis director. In this capacity, we hear from a lot of individuals incarcerated as often need assistance. And as the New York State field director, I direct 10 plus criminal justice campaigns. Turn on the Tap NY is just one that I directly relate to, having been criminally impacted in 2013. And in 2015, while incarcerated, I was refused tuition assistance to finish my higher learning education. I was told that enrolling in college course while incarcerated would cost me $3,500 per semester. That's why today's discussion is very important. I'm glad all of you tuned in. Today, we will be discussing how TAP, restoration for people in prison, is an extension of the punitive, historic denial of education of Black Americans. This panel is in conjunction with the Turn on the Tap NY campaign, hashtag Turn on the Tap NY campaign, a statewide effort to restore tuition assistance program funding to incarcerated students. Tuition assistance program. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce you to the co-sponsor of TAP, ban repeal legislation. He represents Southeast Queens, youngest Black man elected to the New York State Assembly member Khalil Anderson.
Greetings, everyone. It's your favorite New York State Assembly member Khalil M. Anderson, proudly representing the beautiful 31st Assembly District. Today, I'm here to advocate for us to turn on the tap. But before I do that, I want to take us down a journey of history. In 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion. For those who don't know, that rebellion changed the course of American history. Nat Turner was an enslaved Virginian who learned to read and write. He united together with other enslaved Black people and fought for freedom. Now, the important message during that moment in 1831 is that Nat Turner learned to read and write, which then in turn he learned to fight for his freedom. Literacy has always been a tool for self-determination. Education is a powerful vehicle for freedom. And as one Howard professor said, an educated enslaved person was a dangerous person. Post Nat Turner's rebellion, we saw that many laws were passed that outlawed teaching an enslaved Black person to read and or to write. Nearly 200 years later, Black and brown people across the state need the opportunity to learn. But unfortunately, there are barriers still, 200 years later, nearly, being placed in the way of teaching them how to read and to write and to gain a valuable education. Our past shapes our present, but one thing that's important is that it doesn't have to shape our future. And so we have to stop the underfunding of schools in Black and brown communities. We have to end the school to prison pipeline. We have to stop and lift the ban on tuition assistance for people who are incarcerated. These are the barriers, the modern day barriers that stand in the way of educating Black and brown people. And in Black History Month, we have to acknowledge that Nat Turner's rebellion wasn't just a rebellion to provide freedom to enslaved Black people across the United States, but it was also the opportunity to educate and the opportunity to provide that freedom through education. So I want to thank my dear colleague, Assemblymember Jeff Aubrey, all of the advocates and families and incarcerated members of our community. I want to thank our community for never giving up on the fight to expand access to literacy and education to all incarcerated New Yorkers. Let's continue that fight together. Let's make sure that we lift the ban on the tuition assistance program for people who are incarcerated.
Thank you, Assembly Member Khalil Anderson. It's great to have young people in position to do things. And before I introduce our next part, I want to give a special shout out to Stephanie Brazil at the College and Community Fellowship for helping to really organize this with Timothy and the team. It's a whole team of them, but shout out to the whole team. And I want to shout out my family, the National Action Network Second Chance Committee, Victor Pate, who's on this call today, who does a lot on this front. So I have to shout out my people and also the team, the family at National Action Network. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the video featuring the story of a Miss Dorian Bess. She and I grew up coincidentally in the same neighborhood, and we experienced the same shortcomings and temptations of our community and surroundings. I was fortunate or unfortunate at 42 to be incarcerated or have any experience with the criminal justice system, where Dorian was a little earlier than that. So please watch her story, the story of Dorian Bess and her experience being denied education inside prison.
You don't recognize the value of education until it's out of reach. Hi, I'm Dorian Bess, an African-American single mom who've been criminal justice impacted, serving 2 bids over 18 and a half years of incarceration. I am also an advocate to all things trauma, including incarceration, mental health, substance use, not only inside, but in my communities. The saying, it takes a village to raise a child, well, it takes education as well to raise our generations so that they understand what the true values in life are. Education opens up a whole different mindset, a whole new world, a whole new vocabulary. You start to think and believe that you can do more with your life. So on my first bid, we did have access to education. And all of a sudden, after 10 months into the program, it was pulled. Little did we know, they were pulling the Pell and TAP grants. That hopelessness that I had, saying, you know what, education is not gonna happen for me. I don't have the money to do it. That hunger, coming home and walking into a job with a bachelor's, even the time that I served a master's degree, would put me at a higher pay grade right now. I wouldn't have to work 2 jobs. African American women are at the bottom of the employment totem pole. Now we're seeing a huge success rate of women completing college, getting doctorate degrees. Young women who say, I'm not gonna be that statistic anymore. I'm going to do whatever it takes for me to be successful. And usually it's through education. And a lot of women inside have that hunger. But when it's not available to you, it's like you feed that hunger with something else. Or you just say, you know what? It's not designed for us, and you give up on yourself. Being incarcerated and uneducated really promotes not an autonomy to move forward, but it takes you back some years, because when you come out, you're really behind the ball, because now you've sat all that time with your mind doing absolutely nothing, and you come home and you feel hopeless. There's no hope in moving forward, and it takes a minute to get out of that black hole of hopelessness, not having education available. It's important that we keep ourselves educated so that we can keep the next generation growing and growing and growing. Because it's just not about incarceration. It's about rebuilding communities over and over and over and over and over again. That's how you move forward. That's how you build communities. You teach.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Dorian Best, come a long way. 19 years in the prison system, denied education while in prison. And this is why we're here today. We need to find out why is this happening. From the inception of slavery in the United States to present day, the denial of education has been consistently used to oppress Black Americans. Today, Black Americans account for 13% of the overall population, but make up 40% of the total carceral population due to the over-criminalization and over-policing of this population, just as parallels have been drawn between mass incarceration and Jim Crow within the carceral space. America chose to weaponize denial of education as a means to control and oppress. College and prison programs used to flourish in the New York State in the 1960s until the 1990s. Then came the morally repugnant and grossly ill-informed wave of laws that caused the carceral system to balloon. The 1994 Violent Crime Bill that, among many things, banned incarcerated people from receiving Pell Grants to obtain post-secondary education. This precipitated the New York State Needs-Based Assistance TAP ban in 1995. Whether one will end up in a facility with education is a matter of chance. Brad Prison Initiative, for example, has been operating since 1999. They are one of our fiercest partners in this fight, amongst several other higher education and prison program providers, and an exemplary college and prison program. But are they able to operate with the private funds like others that exist? Pell funding will be reinstated in 2023, but this is not enough funding to ensure higher education opportunities. In other words, TAP funding is needed in New York State in order for the programs to be able to exist. There's been a false rhetoric in the past that there was a choice between incarcerated students and non-incarcerated students. This has never been the case. Reversing the TAP ban would not take $1 away from regular college students. It is also the case that the pool of TAP money has never been fully drawn down. Good question. Where's that money at? Hashtag turn on the TAP NY is aimed at repealing the ban on tuition assistance program, NY state funding, for incarcerated individuals to access higher education, allowing thousands of additional students behind bars to have the opportunity to attend college. Education is a right. It is also a collaboration of people and organizations that share missions to center the voices of those directly impacted. Follow the @CCF_NY Twitter account. That's again, @CCF_NY Twitter account to stay posted on all the upcoming events for hashtag Turn on the Tap NY. There is a Q&A. Okay. Now, it is my honor to get the panel started. I will introduce to you the first panelist, and the panelists will actually introduce themselves. What I bring to you today, Marilyn Ralston, Executive Director of this fine College and Community Fellowship, who's behind putting this up. D. O'Brien, Executive Director of the Education Trust in New York. And Nick E. Smith, First Deputy Public Advocate of the City of New York. Marilyn, welcome.
Thank you so much, Derek. I am really privileged to be a part of this panel today. We have an amazing panel of speakers today, very knowledgeable. My name is Marilyn Ralston. I'm a Black feminist abolitionist with an incarceration experience. Like you, Derek, I spent many years incarcerated. I'm the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, a New York City-based nonprofit that works at the intersection of racial equity, criminal legal reform, economic justice, and community building. We are one of the first organizations to focus on access to higher education for justice-involved women. Lastly, I'll just share that I hail from Southern California, where I was the program director for Project Rebound at Cal State University, Fullerton. Project Rebound supports the higher education and successful reintegration of the formerly incarcerated and have been doing that work for over 50 years. I'm so proud to be a part of this panel and to be the new executive director for CCF.
Well, we welcome you and we're happy and congratulate you on your new role, and we pray and stand with you that you do a very good job in your role helping our community. Next up is Dia Bryant. Dia?
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dia Bryant. I'm the Executive Director at the Education Trust New York. We are a research, policy, and advocacy organization that focuses on closing opportunity gaps that impact students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. It is totally a pleasure to be here with you all today to talk about the systemic denial of education to Black folks. I come to this work as a former district level leader in New York City, a founding principal in East New York, Brooklyn, and a teacher in Fort Greene. And so while I've not been incarcerated myself, it is very hard to be Black in America and have not been impacted. I've been impacted through many folks that are in my family. And so I just feel, honored to be here amongst you all today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, dear. We look forward to hearing your comments and your knowledge of wealth as well. And next up, and last but not least, we have to bring a fella to the table also to discuss these things with these fantastic women. And I bring to you Nick E. Smith, First Deputy Public Advocate of the City of New York. Nick, how are you?
I'm doing okay, blessed. Thank you, everybody. I'm Nick Smith. Again, as Derek said, First Deputy Public Advocate of the City in the office of our Public Advocate, Jamani D. Williams. So for me, I'm not new to this work. I've been involved in making policy and law at the city and state level for north of a decade here in New York, and of course in California as well, where I was born and raised. I would say one of my biggest achievements was one, being an alum of CCF. I worked at CCF for a couple of years, helping to coordinate the Education from Inside Out work, which helped persuade the Obama administration to launch a pilot program to reinstate Pell in prisons. And secondly, and lastly, I'm a co-author of a law called the Fair Chance Act, which removes the question of criminal histories from the employment application so that we can help bring about some racial equity. And that's the lens that I bring this work, which is equity. I'm glad to be with you all. Thank you. Excellent.
Welcome. And you complete our panel today. And we're going to jump right into it. I'm working here at the Reverend Sharpton. History. He's the National Action Network is in the vein of Dr. King. Reverend Sharpton does everything connected to something in history. So before we even get into all the other stuff, we have to explain the background of taking education out of prison. So I want to put that to Marilyn, please. Please explain the background of taking education out of prisons as part of the 1994 Violent Crime Bill. Did you hear me? Or is it me?
No, I heard you, Derek.
Okay. I just want to make sure.
No, we're good. Thank you for that question. I think it's important to first understand how higher education became widely available in prisons, and then look at how post-secondary education was methodically eviscerated. In 1972, the Higher Education Act of 65 was signed. That was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, was amended by Congress. One of those amendments created the Basic Educational Opportunity Funds, commonly known as the Pell Grant. The Basic Educational Opportunity Funds provided access to higher education among low-income individuals and families that allow for more first-generation and BIPOC individuals to have a clear path towards post-secondary education. It removed the financial barriers that many people faced. The bill that led to the creation of Pell was authored by Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island. That's where we get this name, Pell Grant, from. And the funds were made available to all in 1972, all degree-seeking students who would apply and demonstrate significant financial need. And back then, all meant all. There was no clause preventing or denying incarcerated students from applying for the federal funding under Pell. So, case in point, while I was incarcerated, I received Pell Grants from 1990 to 1993. And it was because of those grants that I was able to take my first college courses. And, I came to understand the transformative power of education, and was able to use that as a tool for my liberation and resistance while inside. So unfortunately for me, Pell was short-lived, because in 1994, during the tough on crime years, Joe Biden sponsored a bill that President Clinton signed into law, as you named earlier, the Crime Bill of 1994. That bill did not take away education or take it out of prisons. What that bill did was it revoked Pell Grant access, Pell Grant funding to any individual who was incarcerated in any federal or state institution or prison. And the provision read, no basic grant should be awarded under this subpart of any individual who was incarcerated in any federal or state penal institution. So the consequence of eliminating Pell funding to incarcerated students was what really stripped away their means to pay for college. And as low-income individuals, who primarily are relegated into the carceral system, it did a lot of damage to our communities. So as a result, many college programs ended. And for several decades, there wasn't access to colleges because universities and college programs weren't funded to provide that education for folks incarcerated. And then, later on in 2015, the Obama administration, as you talked about, and thank you, Nick, for all of your work on this, launched the Second Chance Pell pilot program that really kind of generated and reconstituted access to programs for incarcerated people. And then, later on, it was expanded. And then in 2020, Congress reinstated Pell to begin in, I believe it's July of 2023. So that's kind of the evolution of Pell and how education started and was more widely accessible for folks inside of prisons, and also how it ended and now is coming back.
Excellent. Thank you for that. You guys can hear me, right? Just want to make sure. Good.
Yep.
Good. Thank you for that, Romarilyn. The history of this is very important. We need to know where we come from to know where we're going, and make sure certain injustices doesn't happen again. Because anyone being denied an education is an injustice, regardless. So I want to bring the next question to you, First Deputy Public Advocate. We know the policy, Nick, has benefits that even include the reduction of crime, providing financial aid to those in prison for post-secondary education. How did we get to a place where we have to justify providing education inside as though it's a privilege?
It's a perfect question, particularly as we're dealing with issues of public safety, both here in the city and in the country. And I love how in the video and then in your remarks, Madam Executive Director, that we went through the history, and of course Khalil as well, of how we got here. Go back to slavery and bring it to present day. We know the history. The issue in the 1980s was an issue for many of crime, and that's across the country. And there was a certain political party that thought, well, we keep losing elections in the 1980s, and folks were upset about another party winning elections. Why don't we shift our strategy and try to optically appear a bit more conservative when it comes to public safety? And so, unfortunately, you have folks from a certain political party adopt a furthering of the tough on crime approach that Maryland referenced earlier. And by the early 90s, again, then Senator Biden pushed the bill. Unfortunately, some of our own folk supported that bill and passed that bill. And the results were, of course, the removal of Pell Grant funding and the subsequent removal of state-based funding as well. So we got here based on fear-mongering. And so it's important when we talk about public safety overall, and then, of course, then education. But in terms of public safety, we cannot go backwards. The theory of lock them up and throw the key away is, in fact, a violation of our human rights. And we have to recall the racial and gender dynamic when it comes to our carceral system. 40% of our nation's jails and prisons are filled with Black and brown Americans, where Black folk, for example, are 12% of the population. So we are dramatically overrepresented, and we fail to engage in what the theory of incarceration is, which is rehabilitation. And that includes, by the way, education on the inside. And so, to your point, Derek, at the top, we got to know how we got here to know where we're going. We got here based on fear mongering, and I'm going to be blunt on this, racism. Mm-hmm. But where we're going, my hope is we're turning the tide toward understanding that we got to end the lock them up strategy. We got to stop putting people in jail or prison for petty low-level crimes, including mental health issues, and ensure that if you happen to be on the inside, you've got resources, including higher education, which has dramatic benefits for all of us. And I'll name one of those benefits for those who may be in opposition. It costs $565,000 to incarcerate someone for 1 year. For one person, 1 year, more than $500,000. $500,000. The cost of education is not even 5% of that amount. So you have in prison college courses. You help folks earn their education and awesome skills. You help them earn a living wage, hopefully, either during incarceration or afterward. And then you see the positive societal benefits therein. So that's where we need to be going. And my hope is that no matter what level of government we're talking about, whether it's city, state, or federal, that we all move toward no more lock them up. Let's make sure that we have resources on the inside to help folks re-enter society in the way that's the most productive for all of us.
Excellent. Good answer. No, that was a good answer, because a lot of times we don't think about all the nuances of the issues, right? And Eric Adams, I know our dear Mayor Eric Adams speaks a lot about the school to prison pipeline, right? And the dyslexia and all the shortcomings there. So I want to dive in to Dia, education question. Why is it that New York City amongst the most segregated in terms of schools, and how do we speak in code about this with phrases like underprivileged and inner city and urban? How does it create further problems?
Well, I mean, I'm going to tie two pieces that my colleagues spoke about sort of thematically, but not specifically. Anti-literacy is a part of the fabric of racism and the fabric of education in this country. And even in this moment, after our kids have lost 2 years of instruction, we don't see the focus on literacy that we should see in this moment. And I, call on Frederick Douglass a lot, because he told us that once you can read, you will be free. Right? And it is really, that is true liberation. That is emancipation. And so what we see throughout our education system is sort of the remnants and the particles of old laws trickling into our behaviors and the way in which we look and exercise bias, particularly on Black and brown bodies in this country. So how did we get this way? We didn't stitch the systems together. In order to have true education, we have to think about the ways in which incarceration disrupts the family. And Kenjufu taught us this, right? Mm-hmm. That when we remove a man from a home, we inherently endanger that family in many ways. So, when we talk about the incarceration of Black men, we have to begin thinking about reading and thinking and the experience of school for our Black boys. That is just so important. And those two things are not divorced. When we think about schools, we have to think about housing, the availability, the affordability, and the quality. All three matter. And schooling tends to follow the trend that housing has, right? But it is so rare for us to bring to the table, across difference of race and socioeconomic class, folks who have a shared interest around housing quality, education quality, and the future of Black children, period. And I mean, there's only a few folks thinking this through, but we ended up here by the lack of collaboration and the actual ways in which racism is in the DNA of our country.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Bia. A very, very deep answer to that question. I do want to remind everybody, all the attendees, please put all your questions, comments in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Please put all your questions, comments in the chat. Our panelists will get to answer you, and we'll do it like that. So I want to go back to Rhode Maryland. How can education behind bars act as a disruptor in the school to prison pipeline?
Very, very great question. Thank you so much for asking it. But Dia, your comments were right on. To what you explained was the dismantling of the Black community through all of these different social systems. And from the dismantling and denying access to education, it's really what has set us up for a lot of this trauma and mass incarceration. And I just want to start with saying that, the arrest, and you talk about the arrest of parents, the impact of that arrest on a child can be very traumatic. The removal of a mother or father from a child's life forces that child to confront emotional, social, and economic consequences that may trigger all kinds of problems in school: behavior problems, poor outcomes, violence, fighting, hunger. All of those things persist when a parent is removed from the family and then incarcerated. But I think first it's really important to define what is the school to prison pipeline. Some of our viewers may not understand that. And I really love this definition from NYCLU. It says the school to prison pipeline refers to education and public safety policies that push students into the criminal legal system. And I love that it pushes students into the criminal legal system instead of providing, a healthy, holistic learning environment for students. And most of those students, as we know, are Black and brown people. Schools send students into the pipeline through zero tolerance, discriminatory, disciplinary policies, which involve the police in minor misbehaviors that often lead to arrest and juvenile detention referrals. Well, this can result in criminal charges and incarceration, but this is what builds the school to prison pipeline. It's through suspensions, expulsions, discouragements, disparities in testing, lack of quality teachers in the school, again, hunger, poor housing in communities. All of these things exacerbate the school to prison pipeline. And as you mentioned, it disproportionately impacts youth of color, youth with disabilities, LGBTQ students, folks who are already on the margins. And just for a little more historical background on zero tolerance laws, they were passed, of course, during this whole era of tough on crime back in the 80s and 90s. And these policies, were intended to keep our schools safe, but they really impacted Black and brown communities more because as the policies were created around basically gun safety in schools, what folks did was add on a lot of other kind of issues that were around dress code violations, cursing, insubordination, being tardy. So it just kept building and building and building in our communities, in the Black and brown communities. And it wasn't really intended for those kinds of infractions. Those very minor infractions were labeled disciplinary problems, and it pushed, again, I love that definition by NYCLU, it pushed our students into the criminal legal system. And today, 1 in every 50 children in the United States have a parent in prison, 1 in 50 students. So that's an outrageous, statistic. It's outrageous. And we should really be working towards trying to build our school system in a way that less impacts children. But, finally, I just want to, give a few more statistics about this around when we send parents to prison and what the impact of that is and what it looks like. There's an estimated 684,000 plus folks who are incarcerated who are parents. And 47% of those folks are in state prisons and 58% in federal prisons. And what that breakdown looks like is that among minor children of parents in state prisons, 1% are younger than the age of 1. 18% are between the ages of 1 and 4, and 48% are over the age of 10. And so we really have to see, that we're talking about children in their earliest developmental years. And so these policies and these really horrific and aggressive tracks into the criminal legal system during a child's developmental years, has a lifelong consequence. And so this is what the school to prison pipeline has created in many Black and brown communities by removing parents who are Black and brown and pushing them into the carceral system and incarcerating folks for long periods of time.
Thank you, Romarilyn, for that. That was very, very insightful and very right on point, right on track. So we're talking about the school prison pipeline. So I want Nick to tie it in on how the state's rejection of Board versus the Brown versus the Board of Education led to the over-policing and the surveillance we see in our schools, Nick.
Sure. And when we talk about Brown versus Board, we're talking about segregation. And New York City has, I believe, the most segregated schools in the country. And that includes not just issues of race, but also resources. And folks may have heard of something called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. And that was a court case many years ago led by, I think, Senator Robert Jackson, who I think represents actually CCF. And he and many other parents from the Harlem neighborhood sued over inequitable funding for schools across this city as compared to others in the city and across the state. And many years ago, the high court of the state decided, you know what, Senator and plaintiffs, you're right. The formula is screwed up. There are lack of not just funding, but other resources in the schools, including nurses, counselors, other wraparound services that we need to remain on this point to avoid exacerbating an existing school to prison pipeline. And so we just got an agreement in the last year to send some of that money to cities across the state, including DOE. So what we need the city to do is make sure that we're finally looking at what are the real needs of schools across this city. And it isn't always money, it's also programming, but money is a big part of it. And we also need to listen to our students when we talk about the school to prison pipeline. Sit down with students and hear what they have to say. And here's what I've heard from my purpose, the first deputy. Public Advocate's Office, we don't have enough counselors. We don't have any college counselors. I want to go to college. I don't know who to talk to if I'm being bullied on campus. I need to bring a weapon into school because I need to protect myself against the bully. And so listen to them. They're telling us the conditions that, again, exacerbate the problem. And to Romarilyn's point earlier, it's systemic. It's housing, it's food insecurity, it's a lack of health care. So if you're sick and you got to stay at home, you're missing school. It's all these issues. And so my hope is that government writ large finally begins to slow down and listen to what our young people are saying. The solutions are there. Yeah. And we can't be in the posture, Derek, and I wrap here of, top down, I know everything. Let's be clear. The system is working as it was designed. Yes. It was designed for us to fail. Young people are telling us how we're failing them. I grew up in a public school with all those social conditions. I grew up in public housing. I went to public schools where my A+ from or A or A- in my high school didn't look that great to UC Berkeley, where I eventually went. You know what they told me? We'll admit you, but guess what? You got to go to summer school and prove to us that those A's are the same as the A's of a Beverly Hills high school kid in Maryland. I'm from Inglewood, California, or the A from Torrance or wherever else. And I grew up on food stamps, public housing. I've lived it myself. And so I'll wrap with this. Just listen to our young people who will tell us how to end that school or prison pipeline.
We have to listen to our young people. Thank you, Nick. We have to listen to them. Like you said, they're telling us what it is. They're telling us what's happening real time on the ground. As we get older, we kind of forget things, and you know, that's how the kids, you know, we had our era, you know, and the kids have their era. So we have to listen to them, have to pour some resources into them, some way, some form. So let's move it on to Dia. People see mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow, thanks in large part to the success of Michelle Alexander's book, which I've read. I advise everyone here, if you haven't read it, you should. Have we had the same reckoning with understanding, Dia, the connection between anti-literacy laws, Plessy versus Ferguson, and ongoing ways in which we deny education of Black Americans?
Whew, we could write an essay on that one. I mean, that's a lot. But you know, I will talk a little bit about New York City just to sort of give you a scope on that. You know, the education issue in New York City is a question of variation, right? It is a question of variation across neighborhoods, meaning, you know, if you've spent any time on the ground, you know that East Harlem is significantly different than Tribeca. And these are the same public schools with the same public dollars. However, there are different amounts of opportunity, right? And I would challenge, and because I know very clearly that even within those schools, within the classrooms, there is variation, meaning that there are some children sitting in single rooms, 30 kids, where 5 children don't have the exact same opportunity as the other 25. And so there are things that need to be addressed in terms of how we resource, how we think about curriculum across the city in terms of its quality and delivery, and then how we think about resourcing beyond sort of typical dollars. And I think Nick was hinting at this, but I'm going to name a few of the things that create distinction. Facilities, right? I grew up in a house with no heat and hot water. It was very hard for me to stay home during the day. So I had perfect attendance, right? That there it is the truth for some of our families that going to school is the place where there is heat, there is light, there is food.
There is food.
Right there. And so when they have to go to school and they see their worth in the broken windows and the broken walls and the broken chairs and the graffiti desks, they see what we think of them. Right. And over time, after you've been so many places where things just look bad wherever you go, you begin to internalize things and determine your own personal worth. And I don't think that's fair. Right. We have work to do. For students in New York City, Black and brown students particularly, they tend to go to what Gary Orfield calls apartheid schools. Now, these are schools where students experience what we call double segregation, right? They are segregated not just by race, but also by socioeconomic status, right? So you've got low income and race doubled up in a school at 90-something% each, right? That's an issue because we know what follows that: novice teachers, poor curriculum, high turnover, poor facilities, right? So there's a lot that we need to talk about comprehensively. And it's sort of, yes, it's about money, but it's also about who we care about most and who we are actually designing policies for. And that's usually my first question when I see a piece of legislation or a law. Who is this for? And it's a serious question.
No, absolutely. You have to ask that. You know, who is it for? You know, I sit on the community board here in Harlem, and all these developers come want to build projects, and it's like, okay, the minimum income is $150,000. You know, then they say, well, you don't feel a Black person can't have a job and make that type of money. Yeah, we do, but we're not going to spend that here. We're going to go somewhere. Or who are your target audience? And we're not dumb to that, dear. So that's a good point. That's an excellent point. So Nick, I want to go over to you because we're getting close to our time. We're 10 minutes out. This has been going real well. As an advocate for these policies through your work in education and from Inside Out Coalition several years ago to where you sit now, Nick, has there been a change in how we view providing education to incarcerated people?
That's also a really fantastic question. And a typical lawyer tells you maybe or yes and no. So unfortunately, I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, to the extent that thanks to many people in this movement, both here in New York and across the country, there is a recognition, more so, I think, in the Congress, particularly among one of the political parties, that we got to do something. And earlier I mentioned that it costs north of $500,000 to incarcerate somebody. And we know that education is the most significant way to reduce recidivism, and the revolving door back into the system. And so I've seen some glimmers of hope in that direction. But there's always an ebb and flow to these big fights. Whether you're talking about the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, there's an ebb and flow. And so the no is we're clearly not where we need to be. So we've had progress, and Maryland talked about the legislation, but overall, we're not where we need to be. We are not rehabilitating and making sure that folks leave. And first of all, we're not doing enough to prevent folks from being incarcerated in the first place. That's the first part. And then secondarily, we're not doing enough to support the whole human being. And as I mentioned earlier, the system is designed to fail us, and it's working. When you talk about the racial disparity of more than half of the prison population being black or black and brown, where our population is sub 14%, that means it isn't working. And so what has to happen is we need this group and those watching to continue to work in coalition to demand changes that we need, whether it's at Rikers Island now and the disaster that we're seeing in that jail. Remember, that's a jail, it's supposed to be detention for a short period of time, or prisons across the state in this country. And I think that's where I feel optimism that we're having these discussions and we're going to move the needle forward. And my role is definitely a public advocate. Whatever I can do, whether it's passing a bill for the bills here or pushing the mayor to fix Rikers, including education opportunities, we're going to do it. So we look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thank you.
Excellent, Nick. Thank you for that. Thank you, panelists. And I want to put out to the chat, to the attendees, last chance to put your questions in. Last chance, questions or comments. I want to mention also, before this started today at 1 o'clock, at 11 o'clock a.m., I stood with the community of the Korean American community, the young lady who was followed home, brutally murdered by an individual. I call him a monster, a demon, right? Because nothing like that's supposed to happen, right? He's been in and out of prison. Where's the community supervision? Where is the resources to better him? If he needs mental health, obviously someone who does something like that is in serious need. Why is community supervision not monitoring that and providing the services and steps that's needed for someone like that? So this is our thing. We need to have a better education, but I want to shout out the community and let them know that we all stand in unity with them, in solidarity, and we're all one. But mental health is a real big piece of this that we're talking about, and we need to address that on these levels. So as we wrap up, I want to say, last time, put your questions in, and then I'm gonna ask Marilyn, how is education liberation? A lot of our people talk about being liberated. How is education liberation?
Thanks, Derek. I love this quote by Nelson Mandela. He said, "Education is the most powerful weapon one can use to change the world." Now, his quote is indicative of my own life story. 10 years ago, I walked out of prison after serving 23 years in behind bars. I had $200 in my pocket, the clothes on my back, and a handful of college credits. But in the first 5 years of my release, which statistics say I should have returned to prison after serving that much time.
Because they consider you a part of the process, your system. They say your system. How would they say? Systemized, right?
Exactly. But because I had the advantages of taking college courses inside and walked out with that handful of college courses, I was able to transfer into a college, into a private school, one of the Claremont colleges, Pittsburgh College to be exact. And within those first 5 years, because of what I had access to prior to the 94 crime bill, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2.5 years, a master's degree 2 years after that. Got a job at a university, the largest public university system in the country, the Cal State University system. Worked in that role for 5 years, and now I am here in New York as the executive director of College and Community Fellowship. And I say all that to say, this is the transformative power of education, of higher education. We know this. As Nick said, higher education, post-secondary education is one of the best practices, the best modalities to reducing recidivism and increasing public safety. And it is, I think there are hundreds of thousands of individuals like myself who have gone through the carceral system, who have come out on the other side because of access to education inside that has never returned. And so this panel was about the restoration of TAP. You know, what's happening with providing Pell Grants inside, the history of Pell Grants, and the historical, you know, denial of Black people having access to education because they don't want a Roe Maryland in the world. They don't want a Nick. They don't want a Dare. They don't want a Dia. You know, they don't want us in the world, but we're here. And, you know, as the song say, we started at the bottom, but we're here. We are here. And education is going to continue to put us at the top. And we're going to continue to rise above because that's what our people do.
Amen. Amen for that. Thank you, Marilyn. We have a question. We have a question from our panelists. From Sasha. With New York City nervous about crime, how do we avoid the failed policies? I'll put that to the panel. Anyone can answer? I know Nick said he's ready, but Dia?
I'll jump in for a second just on the education space. I think, we use the language denial, and I want to just name that denial is a spectrum, right? There could be absolutely none or poor quality, right? And both have the same effect. So I want to name that. Number two, I think we're in a unique moment with a new administration where we can articulate a vision forward. And it's what I haven't heard, right? So yes, there was Omicron for the first couple of weeks of January, and we were all going through it. But here we are now, we're heading into March. And that articulation of a vision for education, for public safety, for our path forward out of this pandemic, both economically, academically, like all the ways, right, is not crystal clear. And the more that becomes clear to the public, the more it becomes actionable, both as citizens, as policymakers, as players on the field, right? And we can all say, hey, we headed that way. But we don't have that yet. And so where I'm from, we say the vision and say the vision plain so the people will follow.
That's right.
And that's what we need right now. And so I'm waiting on it. And I'm hopeful that it's coming, but that is our path forward. Excellent.
Lynn from the chat room asked Ro and Dia, thanks for the excellent explanation of the school to prison pipeline. Beyond listening, as Nick said, how do we move to untangle these huge issues?
I think we start with providing basic needs for our students in school. You know, they cannot sit in these classrooms hungry. They need clean water, clean food. They need qualified teachers. They need trauma-informed care. There's so many needs that our kids have, and those things need to be addressed before they can even have a mindset to learn. You know, we're talking about providing basic needs so when kids walk into the classroom, they're ready to learn. You know, they have arts programs and recreation and other ways of expressing themselves that they are trained in besides violence. Because a lot of times in our communities, that's what our training is. It's through violence. We see it represented on TV. And let's not even get into the media's responsibility for a lot of this mess too, and for perpetuating some of these stereotypes. But I think basic needs, and then a lot of trauma-informed care for our communities, parenting supports for parents, but also, you know, we need to love our kids. We need to love our kids. They're little people. We need to respect them, and we need to talk to them in ways that they can learn how to communicate and articulate, as Dia was saying, you know, their vision and their plan for their lives.
Absolutely. It's important for all children. I'm a big believer. Give children a goal to shoot for. Even if they change their mind, give them something to reach for, something to aim for. And even if they change their mind, at least they're on a path to doing something. A lot of our individuals, a lot of our community members, they don't know what they want to do. So, and everybody know idleness is the way to the devil. So give our kids something to do so we won't be in the situation that we're speaking about now. And this is from Beatrice. This will be the final question from the chat. Beatrice asks, why is access to TAP in prison necessary to bridge these opportunity gaps? I'll put it to the floor. Whoever would like to answer that.
I can sure I can jump. Okay, I can jump in briefly. First of all, to the previous question, very quickly, the city council right now is engaging in the budget process. They desperately need you who are watching to show up and testify at these hearings, and that includes, for example, programs that we're saying should be funded, education, of course, and things like summer youth jobs. So check out the city council website for the schedule of hearings. And you can see when you can show up and testify because your voices are critically needed. And when it comes to TAP, again, these monies are, to me, sort of a no-brainer. And the message is very simple. If we fund in-prison college education, we are improving public safety and we are helping folks leave the institution better than when they came. And that's what we should be doing. We should not be sending folks to jail or prison and them coming out in a worse situation. So that message can be told to conservatives, to liberals, to anybody. Improve public safety and help ensure that folks come out whole.
Excellent. So what I want to do is come to Dia and then Robert Maryland, please.
Yes, to Nick's point. And I think I am just really thinking forward about coming out of the pandemic, right? Like who comes out with the economic win? There's a lot of folks that have made money throughout the pandemic. And I have questions about who will have the credentials to have lucrative STEM jobs and lucrative infrastructure jobs coming out of the pandemic. And so turning on the tap allows folks to have credentials when they come into society to work these union jobs that pay well, give a family sustaining wage, put food on the table, and give health benefits that are critical to sustaining life on the outside. So this is important when we think about making sure folks can survive and then thrive, right? Like not just kind of pillar to post, just, really get out here and make an impact. We got to give folks, a fighting chance.
Excellent. Thank you, Dia. Thank you for that. Great having you and Nick. And Ro Maryland, I want to thank you, salute you and your organization. You know you have a partner who stand beside you in the National Action Network. Please utilize us. Let's do some more work together, and we will come to you with the closing remarks.
I mean, I think my colleagues here have said it all. We need to turn on the tap. I mean, it's a no-brainer. Investing in education is far more valuable than investing in corrections. So for all the reasons that they said, and for the stories that folks have heard today and the history of education through a Black lens, we need to turn on the tap.
Excellent. Thank you, Ro Maryland. Thank you, Dia. Thank you, Nick. I'm Derek Perkinson. This was a great panel. Turn on the tap, NY. That's the campaign. Let's get it done this year. Let's let the governor know. Let's let Carl Hastie know. Let's let Andrea Stewart Cousins know. Let everyone know we need this done. It's a lot going on here. With the violence. Again, I mentioned today, rest in peace, Christina Yuna Lee, getting attacked viciously by mental health disturbed man. Now, if he had better resources, better services while incarcerated, he'd been in and out of prison. Some of these things will not be happening. So these things can stop from happening, and we can do it. We can start when folks have a misstep in life and they have to pay their debt to society, they should be allowed to learn so that when they come out and get focused, they can restart their life and begin their life again. Ro Maryland is a perfect example. You're looking at me, perfect example. Derek Perkinson. I now work at the Civil Rights Organization, did 4 years incarcerated, come home, and I'm working at the top civil rights organization in the world. Not only am I working here, I'm a community organizer, but the title is New York State Field Director. The title is National Crisis Director. I'm an executive at the Civil Rights Organization after being a returning citizen, being denied my education in college. I could have been probably higher, get more money if I had my education while incarcerated. So please turn on the tap, get it done this year. Thank you everyone for pulling this together. Stephanie, you're my girl, the hardest working organizer here. Shout out to Timothy. He keeps everything right and tight. And, we'll see you. Follow me on Instagram. Follow the National Action Network. We're doing things constantly. Committees, chapter in every borough. Please tap in, tap on, turn on the tap. Let's go. Thank you. Yeah. Are we done?